On a bitter November evening in London, a 12-year-old girl walked into Sterling's Café with rain dripping from her threadbare coat and asked if she could play piano instead of paying for a bowl of soup. Richard Sterling, the owner, nearly refused. She looked like just another hungry child trying to avoid payment, her trembling hands and worn shoes telling a story he'd seen too many times before. But something in her quiet dignity made him agree. He had no idea that those same trembling hands had once performed Rachmaninoff for the Queen of England at Buckingham Palace, or that her face had graced the covers of classical music journals across Europe. He didn't know that by saying yes, he would save not just her life, but his own shattered heart as well. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. The rain fell in sheets across London that November evening, turning the cobblestone streets into mirrors that reflected the golden glow of street lamps and shop windows. Emma Thompson stood outside Sterling's Café, 12 years old, and shivering so violently her teeth chattered. Her coat, once a deep navy blue, had faded to a tired gray, its hem unraveling in threads that dragged through puddles. The fabric clung to her thin frame, soaked through to her skin, offering no more warmth than tissue paper. In her right hand, she clutched a battered violin case, its leather worn smooth by years of use, the brass clasps tarnished green. Through the cafe's large front window, she could see everything she desperately needed: warmth, light, food. Inside, couples sat at small round tables draped in white linen, steam rising from their coffee cups like tiny prayers ascending to heaven. The walls were painted a soft cream, decorated with gilt-framed paintings of the countryside. A chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals catching the light and scattering it across the room in dancing fragments. Behind the polished wooden counter, pastries sat in neat rows under glass domes, their golden crusts promising sweetness and comfort. The scent of fresh bread and roasted coffee beans drifted through the door's crack, making Emma's empty stomach clench with longing. She reached into her coat pocket with numb fingers, pulling out a small handful of coins. She counted them for the third time, her lips moving silently, hoping somehow the amount would have changed. £3.42. She had seen the menu board through the window. A bowl of soup cost £4. She was 58 pence short, 58 pence away from warmth, from stopping the gnawing hunger that had been her constant companion for 3 days. Emma looked down at her shoes, water seeping through a crack in the sole of her left one. She could walk away. She could try another shop, another street, another hope. But something about this café held her there, rooted to the wet pavement. Perhaps it was the piano she had glimpsed in the far corner, its black lacquer surface reflecting the chandelier's light like a dark mirror. Perhaps it was simply that she had nowhere else to go. Taking a breath that felt like courage, Emma pushed open the door. The warmth hit Emma like a physical embrace the moment she stepped inside. It wrapped around her frozen limbs, making her skin tingle painfully as sensation returned to her numb fingers and toes. The door chimed softly behind her, a delicate bell announcing her arrival. Several customers glanced up briefly before returning to their conversations, their voices a low murmur beneath the soft classical music playing from hidden speakers. The smell was overwhelming. Fresh bread, still warm from the oven, dark roasted coffee, rich and earthy, cinnamon and vanilla from pastries cooling on racks. Emma's knees felt weak. She hadn't eaten a proper meal since Monday. It was now Thursday. She left wet footprints on the polished hardwood floor as she walked to the counter, her violin case bumping against her leg with each step. Behind the register stood a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled into a neat bun. She smiled at Emma, though her expression flickered with concern at the sight of the drenched child before her. Emma's voice came out smaller than she intended, barely above a whisper. "A bowl of soup, please." "The vegetable one." The woman nodded, punching buttons on the register. £4, love." Emma opened her palm, revealing the damp coins. She placed them on the counter one by one, her hands shaking. £1, £2, £3. The smaller coins clinked together as she counted. £3.42. The woman's smile faded. Emma felt her face flush, hot with shame. "I'm sorry. I thought I had enough. I'm so sorry." Her throat tightened. She couldn't cry. Not here. Not in front of these people with their warm clothes and full stomachs. Then she saw it. In the far corner of the café, partially hidden behind a decorative screen, sat a grand piano. Its black surface was dulled by a fine layer of dust. The bench was pushed in close, as if no one had sat there in months, perhaps years. But Emma recognized the shape, the elegant curve of its body. A Steinway. Her heart lurched. She looked at the woman behind the counter, then at the piano, then back again. The words tumbled out before she could stop them, desperate and strange and utterly sincere. "Can I play piano instead of paying?" The woman behind the counter blinked, clearly uncertain how to respond to such an unusual request. Before she could speak, a door behind her opened and a man emerged from what must have been an office. Richard Sterling was in his late 50s, tall and lean, dressed in a charcoal gray suit with a burgundy tie knotted perfectly at his throat. His silver hair was combed back from his forehead, and his shoes gleamed even in the soft light. Everything about him spoke of precision and care, of a man who kept his world in meticulous order, but his eyes told a different story. They were gray-blue, the color of winter storms, and they held a profound sadness that no amount of expensive tailoring could disguise. He looked at Emma, taking in her dripping coat, her desperate posture, the violin case she clutched like a lifeline. His expression hardened. "I'm sorry, but we don't accept performances as payment," he said, his voice polite but firm. "If you don't have enough money, I'm afraid I can't serve you." Emma felt something inside her crumble. She nodded, stepping back from the counter, trying to gather what remained of her dignity. But then she made the mistake of looking up at him, and their eyes met. Richard saw something in that moment that made his prepared refusal die in his throat. It wasn't pleading. It wasn't manipulation. It was simply a child trying desperately to maintain her self-respect while her world fell apart. She wasn't begging. She was offering something of value. The only thing she had left to give. The café had gone quiet. Other customers were watching now, waiting to see what would happen. An elderly gentleman in a tweed jacket lowered his newspaper. A young couple at a corner table stopped mid-conversation. Richard felt their attention like a weight on his shoulders. He looked at the piano. Dust motes dancing in the light above it. No one had played it in 3 years, not since Clara. Something shifted in his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite name. Curiosity, perhaps, or maybe just exhaustion from carrying his grief alone for so long. "All right," he heard himself say. "Play something. If it's good, you can have your soup." Emma's face transformed. Relief flooded through her features, followed immediately by nervousness. Her hands tightened on the violin case. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." Emma set her violin case down beside the piano bench and approached the instrument as if it were something sacred. Her wet shoes made no sound on the carpet beneath the piano. She pulled out the bench, its legs scraping softly against the floor, and sat down slowly, adjusting her position with the automatic precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times before. Her hands hovered above the keys, trembling visibly. She flexed her fingers once, twice, trying to coax warmth back into them. The café had gone completely silent. Even the soft background music had been turned off by the woman behind the counter. Every customer had turned in their seats to watch. The young couple leaned forward. The elderly gentleman folded his newspaper and set it aside. A mother dining with her 2 children gently shushed them, her finger to her lips. Richard stood behind the counter, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Emma closed her eyes for a moment, taking a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her soul. Then she lifted the fallboard, revealing the ivory and ebony keys beneath, and placed her fingers on them with a tenderness that belonged to someone touching the face of a loved one. She began to play. The opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major floated into the air, soft and delicate as snowfall. But within seconds, it became clear that this was not the stumbling attempt of an amateur. This was mastery. Her fingers moved across the keys with fluid grace, each note pure and clear, the melody weaving through the café like golden thread through fabric. The music swelled and receded like breathing, like the tide, filled with longing and memory, and something indefinably beautiful. Emma's entire body swayed gently with the phrases, her eyes closed, her face peaceful despite the dried tear tracks on her cheeks. She wasn't just playing notes, she was telling a story without words, painting emotions in sound, reaching into the chest of every person in that room and touching something they had forgotten was there. The elderly gentleman's eyes grew wet. The mother reached for her husband's hand. The couple in the corner sat frozen, transfixed. This was music that transcended technique, that moved beyond performance into something approaching prayer. Richard felt his breath catch in his throat. His hands uncrossed slowly, falling to his sides as he stared at this bedraggled child who played like an angel might weep. Richard Sterling stood completely still, his hands gripping the edge of the counter so tightly his knuckles turned white. The music washed over him in waves, each phrase pulling him back 3 years, back to evenings when different hands had played this same piano, when different fingers had coaxed these same melodies from these same keys. Clara had loved Chopin. She had played this exact nocturne for her audition at the Royal College of Music when she was 14. She had played it the night before the accident, her blonde hair catching the light from the chandelier, her face serene with concentration. Richard had stood in this same spot, watching her with a pride so fierce it made his chest ache. 2 days later, she was gone, a drunk driver running a red light, and his entire world had shattered like crystal thrown against stone. He had covered the piano the day after her funeral, unable to bear the sight of it. The silence in the café had felt appropriate then, a fitting tribute to the music that had died with her. But now this child, this stranger with rain in her hair and hunger in her eyes, had brought sound back to the instrument that had been Clara's voice. And she played with such feeling, such maturity, that Richard felt as though he were watching his daughter's ghost made manifest. Emma's hands danced through the final phrases, the music growing softer, more delicate, until the last note hung in the air like the final star before dawn. Then, silence. Complete, absolute silence. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Then the elderly gentleman began to clap, slow and deliberate. The mother joined him. The young couple, within seconds, the entire café erupted in applause. People were standing now, some wiping their eyes, others simply staring at Emma with expressions of wonder. Emma opened her eyes, seeming to return from somewhere very far away. She looked startled by the applause, almost frightened by it. She stood quickly, backing away from the piano as if she'd been caught doing something wrong. Richard found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended, thick with emotions he couldn't name. "The soup is yours." He paused, swallowing hard. "And anything else you want." Richard brought Emma her soup himself, carrying the steaming bowl on a small tray with fresh bread and butter, a glass of orange juice, and a slice of apple tart he hadn't charged her for. She sat at a corner table, still dripping, her violin case on the chair beside her. She ate slowly, carefully, as though each spoonful were precious, as though she were trying to make it last as long as possible. Richard watched her from behind the counter, his mind churning. He couldn't let her simply walk back out into that rain and disappear. Something about her playing had cracked open a part of his heart he'd thought sealed forever, and he needed to understand what had just happened. When Emma finished eating, carefully wiping the bowl clean with the last piece of bread, Richard approached her table. She looked up at him with those enormous eyes, wary and hopeful at once. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked quietly. Emma's gaze dropped to her empty bowl. "My parents taught me. They were musicians." Were past tense. Richard understood immediately. "I need someone to play piano here," he said, the words forming even as he thought them. 3 evenings a week, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, 6 o'clock until 9 o'clock. I'll pay you £15 per evening, plus dinner before your shift. Emma's head snapped up, her eyes widening. I don't. Her voice broke. Tears spilled down her cheeks, mixing with the rain that had begun to dry on her skin. I live with my grandmother. She's not well. We don't have much. I've been trying to earn money playing violin on the streets, but I'm not very good at it, and people don't stop when it's raining. And the bills keep coming, and I. She stopped, pressing her hands to her face, her thin shoulders shaking. Richard felt something twist in his chest. This child was carrying burdens no 12-year-old should have to bear. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Then it's settled. You'll start this Friday. Can you be here by 5:30? Emma lowered her hands. Her face was blotchy and red, but her eyes shone with something that looked almost like hope. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I can be here. Thank you. Thank you so much. Friday evening arrived wrapped in fog. The kind that made London feel like something from a Victorian novel. All blurred edges and muted sounds. Emma appeared at Sterling's Café at 5:15, 15 minutes earlier than Richard had asked. She wore the same worn coat, but it was clean now, carefully mended at the seams. Her hair had been pulled back into a neat braid. She carried her violin case in one hand and a small bag in the other. Richard, arranging pastries in the display case, looked up as the bell chimed. Something in his chest loosened at the sight of her. She hadn't been a dream. She was real, and she had come back. Emma went straight to the piano, setting down her belongings with quiet reverence. She lifted the fallboard and began to practice, her fingers running through scales and arpeggios with methodical precision. Richard watched from behind the counter, pretending to organize receipts while his attention remained fixed on her. She practiced for 20 minutes, warming up her hands, testing the piano's response to her touch. Then she began to play in earnest. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. The first movement poured out like liquid silver, each note placed with such care, such feeling, that Richard found himself standing completely still, a dishcloth forgotten in his hands. At 6 o'clock, the evening customers began to arrive. The elderly gentleman in the tweed jacket, whose name was Harold, came through the door and smiled when he heard the music. The young couple from Emma's first night returned, requesting the same corner table. By 6:30, every seat in the café was filled. Word had begun to spread through the neighborhood about the piano girl at Sterling's. People came for coffee and stayed for the music. They came for dinner and left feeling as though they'd experienced something transcendent. The atmosphere of the café had shifted entirely. Where once there had been polite conversation and the clink of silverware, now there was music that made people lean back in their chairs and close their eyes. Music that made strangers smile at each other. Music that transformed an ordinary Friday evening into something approaching magic. Richard moved through the room, refilling coffee cups, clearing plates, but his attention kept returning to Emma. And for the first time in 3 years, the weight on his chest felt just slightly lighter. The weeks passed like pages turning in a well-loved book, each evening adding another layer to the tentative friendship growing between Richard and Emma. Richard learned her schedule, knew that she arrived hungry most days, and began preparing small meals for her before her shift. A sandwich, a bowl of pasta. Once, on a particularly cold evening, he brought her hot chocolate topped with whipped cream and a dusting of cinnamon, setting it on the piano's music stand while she played. Emma had looked up at him with such surprised gratitude that Richard had to turn away, blinking hard. He started asking her questions during her break, casual inquiries that gradually painted a picture of her life. She attended the local comprehensive school, took the bus each morning, sat in the back of her classes, and tried to be invisible. Her teachers thought she was quiet, unremarkable. They had no idea what her fingers could do. When Richard asked about music, about where she'd learned, Emma's guardedness would soften. She told him about her parents, both professional musicians who'd met in an orchestra. Her mother had played violin, her father piano. They'd taught her from the time she could sit upright, filling their small flat with Mozart and Bach and Debussy. She spoke about them in careful sentences, as though the words might break if she pressed too hard. One evening in early December, Emma arrived with shadows under her eyes darker than usual. During her break, Richard brought her tea and sat across from her. After a long silence, she spoke. "My grandmother needs more medication. The doctor says she needs to see a specialist, but it costs so much. I don't know how we'll manage." Her voice was barely audible. Richard said nothing. The next Friday, he handed Emma her pay in a small envelope. She opened it later, tucked in the corner during her break, and her eyes widened. Instead of £45 for 3 evenings, there were 75. When she tried to return it, insisting there'd been a mistake, Richard simply shook his head. "Your playing brings more customers. You've earned it." It was a lie, but a kind one. Emma began bringing him things too. A drawing she'd done in art class of the Café. A used paperback she'd found in a charity shop, thinking he might like it. Small gestures that said what neither of them could quite put into words. "You matter. You're not alone." December arrived with frost on the windows and strings of white lights wrapped around the cafe's exterior. Richard's staff decorated the interior with garlands of pine and holly, hung wreaths on the walls, and placed a small Christmas tree in the corner opposite the piano. Red and gold ornaments caught the chandelier's light, scattering crimson reflections across the cream-colored walls. The cafe smelled of cinnamon and nutmeg, of gingerbread and mulled wine. Everyone seemed touched by the season's magic, their voices brighter, their tips more generous. Everyone except Richard, Emma noticed. She had grown attuned to his moods over the past weeks. Could read the set of his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes. As Christmas approached, that sadness she'd seen in him from the first night deepened into something heavier. Something that made him move through the cafe like a man walking underwater. One evening, during her break, Emma stood at the counter waiting for her tea. Behind the register, partially hidden by the espresso machine, was a framed photograph she'd noticed before but never asked about. A teenage girl with blonde hair sat at a piano, her hands poised above the keys, her face lit with joy. The resemblance to Richard was unmistakable in the shape of her eyes, the curve of her smile. Emma's voice was gentle when she spoke. "Who is she?" Richard's hand stilled on the cup he was drying. He turned, following Emma's gaze to the photograph. His face closed like a door slamming shut, all expression draining away except for a profound, bottomless grief. "My daughter," he said, his voice flat. "Clara. She passed away 3 years ago." The words hung in the air between them. Emma felt tears prick her eyes. She understood loss, knew its taste, its weight, the way it hollowed you out and left you walking through the world like an echo of yourself. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Richard only nodded, unable to speak. That evening, Emma played Pachelbel's Canon in D. She didn't know it was Clara's favorite piece, didn't know Richard had heard his daughter play it 100 times. But somehow, in the way that grief recognizes grief, she chose it. Richard stood in his office, the door cracked open just enough to hear. And as the familiar melody filled the cafe, he sank into his chair and wept. The following Saturday, Emma arrived at the cafe with fear written across her face in lines too deep for a 12-year-old to carry. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen. Her hands shook as she removed her coat. She went through the motions of preparing for her set, sitting at the piano, adjusting the bench, flexing her fingers. But when she began to play, something was terribly wrong. The notes were correct. Technically, the performance was flawless, but the soul had gone out of it. Emma played like a machine, her fingers moving across the keys with mechanical precision, while her mind was clearly somewhere else entirely. Customers glanced at each other, confused by the change. Harold frowned into his coffee. The young couple exchanged worried looks. This wasn't the music that had transformed their evenings, that had made them feel something transcendent. This was just sound filling space. Richard knew immediately that something had happened. He watched Emma from behind the counter, saw the rigid set of her spine, the way she stared at the keys without really seeing them. When her set ended, and she stood to take her break, he was already waiting. He touched her shoulder gently. "Come with me." He led her to his office, a small room behind the kitchen with a desk buried under paperwork and the same photograph of Clara on the wall. He closed the door, shutting out the cafe's noise, and turned to face her. "What happened?" Emma's composure shattered. She collapsed into the chair, her face crumpling, sobs tearing from her throat with the force of something too long held back. "My grandmother," she choked out between gasps. "She collapsed this morning. They took her to hospital. They say she needs surgery, but it costs thousands of pounds. And we don't have insurance. And I don't know what to do. If she dies, I'll have no one. I'll have nowhere to go. They'll put me in foster care. And I can't. Richard knelt beside her chair, his hand on her shoulder. Something fierce and protective surged through him, an instinct he thought had died with Clara. "How much do you need?" Emma shook her head violently. "I can't take charity. I won't." "It's not charity," Richard said firmly. "It's an advance on your salary. You'll work it off. I need you here, Emma. The cafe needs you." 2 weeks before Christmas, after Emma's grandmother had been released from hospital with medication that Richard had quietly paid for, an elderly woman named Margaret approached the counter during Emma's performance. Margaret was a regular, came every Sunday afternoon for tea and scones, always dressed impeccably in wool skirts and pearl earrings. She had kind, intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone who'd spent her life in cultured circles. Richard was wiping down the espresso machine when Margaret leaned across the counter, her voice low and urgent. "Richard, may I speak with you privately for a moment?" He followed her to a quiet corner near the Christmas tree, away from the other customers. Margaret's fingers worried at the clasp of her handbag, her brow furrowed in concentration. "That girl," she said, glancing toward Emma at the piano. "The one who plays. What's her full name?" Richard felt a protective instinct flare. "Emma Thompson." "Why do you ask?" Margaret shook her head slowly, her eyes narrowing as she studied Emma's profile. "I know I've seen her before. Years ago. Her face is so familiar, but I can't quite place where." She paused, tapping her finger against her lips. "Does she have any connection to the Royal Academy of Music? Or perhaps the Royal College?" Richard blinked in surprise. "Not that I know of. She's just a local girl who needed work. She lives with her grandmother." But even as he said it, doubt crept in. He thought of the way Emma played, the sophisticated technique, the emotional maturity that belonged to someone with years of professional training. No child taught themselves to play like that. Not even with musical parents. Margaret frowned. "It's bothering me terribly. I attend concerts regularly, you see. I'm certain I've seen her somewhere before. Maybe it was a youth competition? Or a recital?" She watched Emma finish a piece, saw the way her hands moved with absolute confidence. "That level of skill doesn't come from casual lessons, Richard. That child has had world-class training." Richard felt something shift in his understanding. He'd been so focused on helping Emma, on easing her immediate struggles, that he'd never really questioned the magnitude of her talent. But Margaret was right. Emma didn't just play well. She played like a professional, like someone who'd spent years under the guidance of masters. What was her story? And why was she busking on street corners for coins? The next evening, Richard brought Emma her usual pre-shift meal and lingered at the table longer than necessary. She was eating shepherd's pie, the steam rising from the plate in soft curls. He sat down across from her, his movements careful, deliberate. "Emma," he began gently, "I've been wondering, where did you train? Your playing? It's extraordinary. That kind of skill requires serious instruction." Emma's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Her expression shuttered immediately, a wall going up behind her eyes. "My parents taught me," she said quietly. "I told you that." "Yes, but surely there were other teachers? Conservatory instructors? Private lessons with professionals?" He kept his voice soft, non-threatening. "You play pieces that most adults struggle with. You have technique that takes years to develop." Emma set down her fork. Her appetite clearly vanished. "I used to take lessons. Before my parents died. After that, we couldn't afford it anymore." She picked up her napkin, folding it into smaller and smaller squares. "Can we talk about something else?" Richard watched her hands, saw the tension in her fingers. "What kind of lessons? Where?" "Just lessons. A music school. It doesn't matter anymore." Her voice had gone flat, emotionless. "That part of my life is over. But she was lying, not maliciously, not to deceive him, but to protect herself. Richard could see it in the way she wouldn't meet his eyes, the way her shoulders had drawn up toward her ears. The question wasn't whether she was hiding something. It was why. He thought about her level of skill, the way she played Chopin and Beethoven and Rachmaninoff from memory, the sophistication of her interpretations. Basic lessons at a local music school didn't produce that. Years of intensive professional training produced that. The kind of training that cost thousands of pounds, that required auditions and dedication and immersion in a world far beyond casual hobby. Emma stood abruptly, gathering her plate. I should start playing. It's almost 6. Richard let her go, watching as she walked to the piano with rigid posture. She was hiding something enormous, he realized. Not from shame, but from pain. Whatever her past had been, whatever world she'd inhabited before tragedy struck, it hurt too much to remember, and he understood that. He understood it perfectly. Christmas week arrived draped in magic, the café glowing with candlelight and evergreen boughs. Emma had chosen to play carols for her sets, but these were no simple renditions. In her hands, Silent Night became a meditation on peace and longing. O Holy Night soared with such emotional power that grown men reached for their handkerchiefs. She wove variations through familiar melodies, adding jazz harmonies to God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen, turning in the bleak midwinter into something that made the soul ache with beauty. On Tuesday evening, 4 days before Christmas, a distinguished gentleman entered the café. He was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair swept back from a high forehead, wearing an expertly tailored charcoal overcoat and burgundy scarf. He carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to command, to respect, to rooms falling silent when he entered. He ordered a black coffee at the counter, his accent crisp and educated, then turned to find a seat. That's when Emma began playing The First Noel. The man froze mid-step, his head snapped toward the piano, his expression shifting from casual interest to absolute shock. The coffee cup trembled in his hand. He stood rooted in place for the entire piece, his eyes fixed on Emma with an intensity that made Richard uncomfortable. When the carol ended, the man set down his untouched coffee and walked directly to the counter. His face was pale. "Excuse me," he said to Richard, his voice urgent. "That girl at the piano. What is her name?" Richard felt his protective instincts flare. "Why do you ask?" The man's eyes never left Emma. "Please. Her full name. It's important." Richard hesitated, then answered carefully. "Emma Thompson." The man's breath caught. "Emma Victoria Thompson?" Richard's confusion must have shown on his face. "I don't know her middle name." The gentleman reached into his coat pocket and produced a business card, pressing it into Richard's hand with fingers that shook slightly. "My name is Sir Christopher Ashford. I am the director of the Royal Academy of Music." He paused, swallowing hard. "And if that child is who I think she is, the music world has been searching for her for 2 years." Richard led Sir Christopher to his office, closing the door against the café's noise. His mind raced with questions, with a growing sense that everything he thought he knew about Emma was about to shift beneath his feet. Sir Christopher sank into a chair, his composure cracking. Emma Victoria Thompson was 8 years old when she auditioned for the Royal Academy. "We've been training young musicians for over 200 years, and we've never seen anything like her. She played Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2 from memory, with such technical precision and emotional depth that 3 of our panel members wept." He paused, his hands clasped tightly together. "She was the youngest student ever accepted into our program, the youngest in the Academy's history." Richard felt the air leave his lungs. "When she was 10 years old," Sir Christopher continued, his voice growing softer, "she was selected to perform at Buckingham Palace for the Queen's 80th birthday gala. Solo piano, Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. In front of the royal family, the Prime Minister, dignitaries from 40 countries. She was a child, playing music that defeats most adults, and she was flawless, absolutely flawless." He pulled out his phone, scrolling through images until he found what he was looking for. He turned the screen toward Richard. A photograph of a younger Emma, perhaps 10 years old, wearing a white dress, standing beside an enormous grand piano in an opulent room. Her hair was styled elegantly, her posture confident. She was smiling. Richard barely recognized her. The Queen herself requested an encore. Sir Christopher said quietly. Emma played Debussy's Clair de Lune, and there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The press called her Britain's brightest musical hope. She was on television, in newspapers, destined for a career that would have made her one of the great pianists of our generation. He put the phone away, his expression darkening. Then tragedy struck. Her parents, Michael and Victoria Thompson, both accomplished musicians, were killed in a car accident on the M25. A lorry driver fell asleep at the wheel. They died instantly. Richard closed his eyes. Emma was 11. She attended the funeral, stayed with her grandmother, and simply vanished from the music world. Stopped attending the academy. Stopped answering calls. We tried to reach her, to help, but her grandmother refused all contact. We thought perhaps the grief was too much, that she'd given up music entirely. Sir Christopher looked up, his eyes bright. But she didn't give up. She's been here all along. Emma finished her final carol of the evening. A haunting arrangement of "What Child Is This?" that left the café in reverent silence. She stood from the piano bench, preparing to take her break, when her eyes landed on the man standing beside Richard near the counter. Her face went completely white. All color drained from her cheeks as recognition slammed into her like a physical blow. Sir Christopher Ashford, Director of the Royal Academy, the man who had hugged her after her Buckingham Palace performance, who had called her parents to praise her genius, who had tried to visit after the funeral. Emma grabbed her coat, her movements jerky with panic. She headed for the door, nearly knocking over a chair in her haste. "Emma, wait." Sir Christopher's voice was gentle but carried across the café. She froze, her hand on the door handle. "Please, don't run." Every customer had turned to watch. The café held its collective breath. Sir Christopher approached slowly, his hands visible and open. "Emma, the music world has been looking for you. We've been so worried." Emma's shoulders began to shake. "I can't," she whispered. "Please, don't make me go back there." Emma Victoria Thompson, Sir Christopher said, loud enough for everyone to hear, performed at Buckingham Palace when she was 10 years old. She played for the Queen. She was the youngest student ever accepted to the Royal Academy of Music. She was destined to become one of the greatest pianists Britain has ever produced. Gasps rippled through the café. Harold stood, his mouth open. The young couple stared in disbelief. Margaret clasped her hands to her chest, vindicated. Richard felt as though the floor had shifted beneath him. This child who had asked to play piano for soup, who had walked in drenched and desperate, had performed for royalty. Emma turned slowly, tears streaming down her face. Her walls, so carefully constructed, crumbled entirely. "I couldn't do it anymore," she sobbed. "After they died, every time I sat at a piano, I saw them. I heard my mother's voice correcting my fingering. I felt my father's hands guiding mine. Music was everything we had together, and when they were gone, playing felt like drowning. Every note reminded me of what I'd lost. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't survive it." Emma's knees buckled. She would have fallen if Sir Christopher hadn't caught her arm, guiding her gently to a chair. She buried her face in her hands, her whole body convulsing with sobs that came from a place deeper than grief, deeper than pain, from the very bottom of a well she'd been drowning in for 2 years. "I gave it all up," she cried, her voice breaking on every word. "I walked away from the academy, from the scholarships, from everything. I couldn't play anymore. Every note reminded me of them, of my mother humming while she practiced, of my father's laugh when I made a mistake, of the way they'd sit on either side of me at the piano, all 3 of us playing together. Music was our language, and when they died, I lost the ability to speak it." She looked up, her face ravaged by tears, her eyes red and desperate. "But then, we had nothing. My grandmother and I had nothing. The bills kept coming, and she got sick, and I realized I had to do something. So I picked up their old violin, the one my mother used to play, and I went to the streets to busk. But I was terrible at it. I couldn't play the violin like I could play piano, and even if I could, every note made me want to die. I'd stand there in the cold, playing badly, watching people walk past like I was invisible. Her voice dropped to a whisper. That night when I came here, I'd been busking for hours in the rain. I'd made 3 pounds. I was so hungry, so cold, so tired of fighting. And then I saw your piano through the window. I don't know what made me ask. I just thought, maybe I could try again. Maybe if I played one more time, it wouldn't hurt so much. Richard moved before he could think. He crossed the café, knelt beside Emma's chair, and pulled her into his arms. She collapsed against him, sobbing into his shoulder while he held her like she was his own daughter. Like she was Clara come back to him, like she was every broken thing in the world that needed someone to say it would be all right. You did try again, he said, his own voice thick with tears. And you brought music back into my life when I thought I'd lost it forever. Sir Christopher remained standing, giving Emma time to compose herself in Richard's arms. When her sobs finally quieted to hiccups, he spoke with gentle authority. Emma, your place at the Royal Academy is still waiting for you. It never stopped waiting. We held it, hoping you'd come back. Full scholarship, all expenses covered, living arrangements in our residence halls, meals provided, private instruction with our finest teachers, everything you need to become what you were always meant to be. The café door chimed. Emma's grandmother entered, moving slowly with the help of a cane, her face lined with worry and love. Richard must have called her during the revelation. She was a small woman in her 70s, wearing a threadbare coat and sensible shoes, but she carried herself with dignity. Emma looked up, saw her, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. Gran. Her grandmother crossed the café with surprising speed, pulling Emma into her arms. My darling girl, my brave, brave girl. They held each other, rocking slightly, while the entire café watched with streaming eyes. Sir Christopher waited patiently. Finally, Emma's grandmother pulled back, cupping Emma's face in wrinkled hands. You have to go back, she said firmly, though her own voice shook. Your parents would want this. They gave you this gift, and you honor them by using it, not by hiding from it. But what about you? Emma whispered. What about the bills? What about... I'll manage. I always have. Her grandmother smiled through tears. Besides, Sir Christopher and I will have much to discuss about your care. Emma turned to Richard, her face anguished. What about you? What about the café? I can't just leave you. Richard was crying openly now, tears running down his face unchecked. He took Emma's hands in his, holding them tightly. You have a gift that belongs to the world, Emma. You were meant for stages far bigger than this café. You were meant to play in concert halls, to record albums, to inspire millions. His voice broke. You brought light back into my darkness. You reminded me that beauty still exists, that love doesn't die when we lose someone. You gave me that gift. Now I'm giving you yours back. You have to go. Emma wiped her eyes, looked from her grandmother to Richard to Sir Christopher, and nodded slowly. I'll go back to the academy, she said, her voice steadier now, filled with something that sounded almost like hope. But on one condition. She turned to Richard. I play here every Sunday until I leave. One last performance each week. For you. For everyone who believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. Richard's face crumpled with gratitude. Every Sunday. I'll save you the best dinner in the house. The final weeks of December became something out of a dream. A period of time that everyone in the café would remember for the rest of their lives as touched by grace. Word spread through London like wildfire. The prodigy had returned. Emma Victoria Thompson, who had played for the Queen, was performing in a small café in their neighborhood. Journalists came with cameras and notebooks. Music critics arrived in expensive coats. Television crews requested interviews. But Emma refused them all. These performances weren't for fame or recognition. They were for Richard, for Harold and Margaret and the young couple, and everyone who had sat in this café and listened when she needed to be heard. Every Sunday, The café filled to capacity an hour before Emma was scheduled to play. People stood along the walls, sat on the floor, pressed their faces against the windows from outside. Richard had to turn away dozens each week, apologizing profusely, promising they could try again next Sunday. Emma played as though each performance might be her last, pouring everything she had into the music, and between Sundays, she and Richard grew closer still. He took her shopping for clothes appropriate for the academy. She helped him choose a new photograph of Clara to display, one where his daughter was laughing, alive with joy. They had dinner together on Wednesday evenings, just the two of them, talking about music and loss and the strange ways life brings people together when they need each other most. She had become the daughter he'd lost. He had become the father she needed. Neither of them said it aloud, but both of them felt it. That fierce love that forms not from blood, but from recognition. From two broken souls finding completeness in each other's company. January arrived cold and clear, the kind of winter morning where frost painted flowers on windows and breath hung visible in the air. Emma's final Sunday performance drew the largest crowd Sterling's Café had ever seen. Fire marshals had to be called to manage the people spilling onto the street. Inside, every chair was occupied, every inch of floor space claimed. Harold sat in his usual spot, handkerchief already in hand. Margaret wore her finest pearls. The young couple held hands tightly. Emma's grandmother sat at the front table, beside an empty chair reserved for Richard. Sir Christopher stood near the door, dignified and silent. Emma approached the piano wearing a simple blue dress Richard had bought her, her hair loose around her shoulders. She sat, adjusted the bench, and placed her hands on the keys. Then she spoke, her voice clear and strong. "Tonight I'm playing something I wrote. I call it The Sterling Heart. It's dedicated to the man who saved my life by letting me play for soup." She found Richard in the crowd, smiled at him through tears already gathering in her eyes. Then she began to play. The composition started soft and hesitant, like footsteps in the rain, like a frightened child standing outside a warm café. It built slowly, weaving themes of loss and loneliness, but then the melody shifted, transforming into something warm, something that spoke of kindness and second chances and love that asks nothing in return. The music swelled with hope, with healing, with the sound of two broken hearts learning to beat again. By the time Emma played the final notes, there wasn't a dry eye in the café. People weren't just crying, they were weeping openly, holding each other, undone by the beauty of what they'd witnessed. Emma stood, turned to face the crowd. "Richard Sterling reminded me that music isn't about fame or perfection. It's about connection. It's about healing. It's about reaching across the darkness and finding another hand reaching back." Richard stood, his face wet with tears. He walked to Emma and handed her a small envelope. Inside was a document, a certificate of ownership. "Clara's piano," he said, his voice breaking. "Restored and tuned. It's yours now. They'll deliver it to the academy tomorrow, so you'll always have a piece of home with you." 5 years passed like music, each year a movement in a symphony that had begun on a rainy November night. Emma Victoria Thompson, now 17 years old, stood backstage at the Royal Albert Hall, breathing slowly to calm her racing heart. Beyond the curtain, 3,000 people filled the iconic venue, waiting for her to appear. She wore a deep blue gown that caught the light like sapphires, her hair swept elegantly back from her face. In her dressing room hung a photograph of Richard Sterling, smiling beside Clara's piano. Now, Emma's piano, the instrument that had traveled with her through countless performances across Europe. Tonight's concert program read, "Dedicated to the man who traded soup for salvation." Richard sat in the front row, wearing his best suit, a packet of tissues already clutched in his hand. Beside him sat Emma's grandmother, frail but radiant with pride. Sir Christopher Ashford occupied the seat to Richard's left. Harold and Margaret had traveled from their neighborhood. The young couple, now married with a baby, had arranged childcare weeks in advance to be here. Emma walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. She had become one of Britain's most celebrated young pianists, performing in concert halls from Vienna to Tokyo. recording albums that topped classical music charts, gracing magazine covers, but she never forgot where her resurrection had begun. She sat at the grand piano, played Rachmaninoff and Chopin and Debussy with a mastery that had made her famous. The audience sat spellbound, transported. During her final bow, as flowers rained onto the stage, Emma held up her hand for silence. 5 years ago, she began, her voice carrying through the hall. I was a 12-year-old girl who walked into a café, soaking wet and starving. I was 58 pence short for a bowl of soup. I asked if I could play piano instead of paying. The owner, Richard Sterling, could have refused. He had every reason to refuse, but he said yes. She told them the story, the grief that had made her abandon music, the poverty that forced her back to it, the kindness of one man that had changed everything. Kindness sees worth where the world sees none, Emma said, tears streaming down her face as she looked directly at Richard. Sometimes the most valuable things cannot be measured in currency, but in compassion. Richard gave me more than soup that night. He gave me back my soul.